June 7, 1944, Normandy, the second day after D-Day. The air still smells of cordite and sea salt. Waves drag fragments of helmets and stretchers back toward the gray surf. Amid the ruins of an American landing craft, a medic kneels beside a motionless soldier, his uniform soaked crimson, his pulse fading. There is no doctor here, no sterile hospital. Only mud, chaos, and a tin case marked U.S. Army Medical Department. Inside it, a glass bottle filled with yellow liquid. Dried blood plasma, reconstituted with seawater. The medic's hands tremble as he threads a needle into the soldier's arm. Drops fall, then flow. Within minutes, color begins to return to a face that was turning blue moments earlier. Around them, machine guns rattle, men shout for help, and stretcher teams sprint through the sand. This small, silent act, a transfusion of plasma instead of whole blood, will be repeated thousands of times across Europe and the Pacific. It will turn near death into survival, and despair into recovery. And it all began years earlier, with one doctor who refused to accept that soldiers had to die simply because blood couldn't last long enough to reach them. At the outbreak of World War II, military medicine lagged far behind the technology of destruction it was meant to counter. Tanks, aircraft, and automatic weapons had advanced at breathtaking speed. But the art of saving the wounded had barely evolved since the First World War. During the trenches of 1918, a soldier struck by shrapnel or gunfire had little chance beyond the nearest aid post. Whole blood transfusions required direct donor-to-patient transfers, sterile glassware, and precise blood typing. It was slow, dangerous, and impractical anywhere near combat. Thousands died from shock, infection, or simple loss of blood. Men who might have survived if only a few more pints could have reached them in time. By 1939, the U.S. Army Medical Department knew it faced a new kind of war, one that would move too fast for traditional field hospitals to keep up. Armies would leap from continent to continent. Casualties would mount not in hundreds, but in tens of thousands. Medical officers urgently sought a way to carry blood, the essence of life, across oceans, deserts, and jungles without it spoiling. In civilian laboratories, a quiet revolution was underway. At Columbia University in New York, a young African-American physician named Dr. Charles Richard Drew was conducting experiments on the separation and preservation of blood plasma. Plasma, the pale yellow liquid that remains when red cells are removed, carried nutrients and clotting agents, and unlike whole blood, it did not need to be precisely matched to a donor's type. More importantly, it could be dried, stored, and reconstituted later with sterile water. Drew's work began as a research thesis, but by 1939 it had drawn attention from the Rockefeller Institute and the American Red Cross. As Britain endured the first Luftwaffe bombings, blood supplies ran dangerously low. The British government appealed to the United States for medical help, and Dr. Drew's plasma preservation method offered the answer. Under the initiative known as Blood for Britain, Drew oversaw the first large-scale civilian-to-military plasma shipment in history. Thousands of American volunteers donated blood, which was centrifuged, separated, and freeze-dried into plasma at laboratories in New York. Each unit could survive weeks of transport, even by ship. When the first containers reached London in 1940, British doctors were astonished. The plasma worked flawlessly. It restored circulation in the wounded, reduced deaths from shock, and required no complex transfusion setups in the field. By 1941, the U.S. Army began adopting Drew's techniques across its own expanding medical system. Laboratories in Brooklyn, Boston, and Washington were soon processing plasma by the ton. For the first time, it became possible to store blood products in forward depots and ship them worldwide. Yet Drew himself faced bitter irony. As a black scientist in segregated America, he was denied military commission despite his critical contribution. When the Red Cross decided to segregate blood by donor race, a decision Drew publicly opposed, he resigned in protest. His stance, though costly, became symbolic of his belief that blood has no color, a principle that would outlive both him and the war. Still, his research moved forward without pause. By late 1942, as U.S. troops fought in North Africa, the new Army plasma program was fully operational. Thousands of medics trained to mix dried plasma with sterile solution under fire. Lightweight kits replaced cumbersome transfusion rigs. A medic could carry salvation in his pack, and a soldier could receive life-saving treatment before evacuation even began. What began as a laboratory thesis had become one of the greatest humanitarian technologies of the 20th century. And soon, as the war expanded from Tunisia to Italy and the Pacific Islands, the true test of Drew's discovery would begin. Not in the laboratory, but on the battlefield itself. By 1943, the lifeblood of the U.S. Army no longer flowed only through men. It flowed through glass bottles and rubber tubes. What had started as a scientific breakthrough in American laboratories became one of the most important logistical operations of the entire Allied war effort. The Beater, Army Medical Department, and the American Red Cross partnered to create a system that mirrored industrial-scale production. Every step was standardized. Donors lined up at civic centers, blood was drawn, plasma separated and sealed, shipments cooled, packed, and sent to embarkation ports. From there, convoys and aircraft carried them toward the front. The initiative's official name, Blood Plasma for the Wounded, concealed its scale. In less than 2 years, over 14 million pints of blood were processed, and tens of thousands of plasma kits were stored in every theater from Alaska to Australia. Each case carried the Red Cross emblem and instructions printed in bold block letters. Mix with sterile water. Administer immediately. Behind those sterile instructions lay a revolution. For the first time in military history, frontline medics could treat shock, the silent killer of the battlefield. Before plasma, a man losing blood would slip into unconsciousness within minutes. With plasma, his blood volume could be stabilized, buying crucial hours until surgery. It did not replace lost red cells, but it kept the heart beating long enough for hope to arrive. The first large-scale combat test came in North Africa. Late 1942, American and British medics, working under fire at Kasserine Pass, mixed and injected plasma directly on the sand. Reports from field surgeons stunned headquarters. Survival rates for the severely wounded doubled compared to the early desert campaigns. Officers requested more shipments, and soon plasma runs became as routine as ammunition deliveries. From North Africa, the technique spread to Sicily, Italy, and the Pacific Islands. On Guadalcanal, medics improvised transfusions under palm trees. In Italy's muddy valleys, plasma flowed in field tents lit by kerosene lamps. Even at sea, aboard destroyers and hospital ships, Navy doctors began carrying plasma kits for wounded sailors pulled from the water. The logistical miracle was matched by an equally important transformation: the rise of the combat medic. In earlier wars, stretcher-bearers were unarmed attendants. Now, they became trained lifesavers, capable of performing complex transfusions and emergency care within minutes of injury. The phrase, "Give him plasma," became as familiar as medic itself, a command that often meant the difference between burial and recovery. German and Japanese intelligence took note. Interrogations of captured enemy soldiers later revealed astonishment at how many wounded Americans returned to battle within weeks. To them, U.S. troops seemed almost impossible to exhaust. What they didn't realize was that it wasn't superhuman resilience. It was science, organization, and compassion working in concert. As 1944 approached, The Allies prepared for the greatest invasion in modern history, Operation Overlord. Behind the scenes, medical planners stockpiled more plasma than had ever been moved in human history. Over 100,000 units were loaded onto ships bound for England. They were labeled not as weapons, but as medical priority, vital. Every beachhead, every airborne drop, every naval landing craft carried it. Each glass bottle represented not just a life saved, but a victory of intellect over chaos, of science over suffering. Soon, that quiet revolution would face its supreme test. Under machine gun fire, on the beaches of Normandy, where medics fought time itself to keep their brothers alive. To understand how one field doctor's technique saved more lives than any new weapon, we must look beyond medicine, into the intersections of science, leadership, and humanity. Three distinct forces made this transformation possible: a visionary doctor's method, the courage of frontline medics, and the quiet efficiency of logistics officers who treated blood like ammunition. The first force, the visionary doctor, belongs to Dr. Charles Drew. Though rarely mentioned beside generals or admirals, Drew's innovations changed warfare as profoundly as radar or code-breaking. Trained at McGill University and Columbia, Drew combined surgical skill with a scientist's obsession for precision. In 1940, he led the Blood for Britain program, shipping blood plasma across the Atlantic to aid bombed British hospitals. It was a logistical nightmare. Plasma spoiled easily, contamination was deadly, and every shipment risked interception by German U-boats. Yet Drew's system worked flawlessly. He standardized sterilization, packaging, and transport, proving that blood could be safely stored for weeks. When the U.S. entered the war after Pearl Harbor, his methods became the foundation of the American Red Cross blood bank system. Still, Drew's story carried tragedy. Because of segregation laws, the U.S. military initially insisted that blood be separated by race. Drew protested publicly, calling the policy scientifically absurd and morally wrong. He resigned in protest, a silent act of defiance that would later mark him as a hero of both medicine and conscience. His departure did not halt the work. The system he built ran like a heartbeat behind the war machine, and every vial sent to a field hospital was a continuation of his idea that human life transcends the barriers of prejudice and geography. The second force, the frontline medics, tells a different kind of courage. They were often 18 or 19 years old, trained for only weeks before being sent into battle. Their job was not to fight, but to walk directly into the line of fire, carrying nothing but bandages, morphine, and plasma. In Normandy, a medic's average lifespan during an active assault was measured in minutes. Yet, they went anyway, crawling through mud, dragging the wounded to cover, inserting needles under mortar fire. Some tied plasma bottles to tree branches or rifle barrels to keep the flow steady. Others mixed it on their knees while bullets snapped overhead. To those they saved, these moments felt miraculous. A soldier bleeding out from a stomach wound would feel the world closing in, until the medic's voice broke through. "Hold on, I've got plasma." Within minutes, the dizziness would fade. The pulse would strengthen. Life returned. It was not medicine performed in sterile hospitals. It was performed in ditches, in foxholes, in burning tanks. Yet the results were undeniable. In the European theater, the mortality rate for battlefield casualties dropped from 30% in World War I to under 4% by 1945. No single weapon achieved such an outcome. No tank, no aircraft, no bomb. Only plasma. A clear, golden liquid gave the wounded the time they needed to live. But there was a third angle still unseen. The invisible system that kept it all running. The chain of logistics, from donor to battlefield, that made Drew's science and the medic's bravery possible. Behind every vial of plasma that reached the front lines, There was an invisible army, logisticians, chemists, nurses, and transport officers who turned fragile medical miracles into a functioning wartime industry. This was the third and perhaps least recognized force, the industrialization of life-saving. By late 1942, under the leadership of the U.S. Army Medical Department and the American Red Cross, blood and plasma had become part of the supply chain of war. Just as divisions required food, ammunition, and fuel, they now required blood units per 1,000 men. In warehouses across the United States, assembly lines filled with nurses and volunteers worked day and night. Each bottle of plasma passed through a sequence of steps: collection, centrifugation, sterilization, sealing, and packaging. The process had to be perfect. A single contaminated batch could kill dozens. The military applied the same logistical thinking used in ammunition depots. Temperature was monitored through newly developed refrigeration units. Labels were color-coded. Crates were shock-tested. In some bases, engineers designed portable plasma refrigerators, small enough to fit in jeeps or cargo planes, allowing blood to reach combat zones within days instead of weeks. Every part of the system evolved through necessity. When the first shipments to North Africa spoiled due to heat, engineers collaborated with the Quartermaster Corps to design insulated containers using aircraft-grade aluminum and cork. When plasma leaked during the long voyage to Europe, Navy supply officers invented gimbaled racks to keep bottles upright during storms. Each of these adjustments, invisible to the public, made Drew's concept indestructible. The result was a medical supply network so reliable that by 1944, the U.S. could deliver plasma to any battlefield on Earth within 72 hours. The Japanese and Germans never achieved such consistency. In German field hospitals, shortages were constant. Blood storage was limited to a few days. Refrigeration was scarce, and transport unreliable. Many wounded soldiers died not from the wound itself, but from shock, infection, or blood loss that could have been prevented. By contrast, American casualty evacuation worked like clockwork. From the moment a soldier was hit, the process began. Frontline medics stabilized him with plasma. Stretcher bearers carried him to a battalion aid station. From there, he was loaded into a jeep, then an ambulance, then a C-47 flying hospital. Within hours, he was in a surgical tent, alive, because of a bottle that had crossed an ocean. This was not luck. It was logistics born of empathy. In war, the U.S. military learned that saving men could be as strategic as killing the enemy. Every life preserved meant one more soldier returning to the line, one more crewman flying another mission, one more unit fighting another day. The same system that fed the armies of democracy also preserved their humanity. It became the unseen heartbeat of Allied strength. A war fought not only with weapons, but with care. And as that care spread, from Red Cross donors in Chicago to medics in Anzio, it transformed the moral landscape of war itself. Because for the first time in modern history, medicine was no longer just about treating the survivors. It was about refusing to let men die in the first place. That realization, that technology and compassion could merge, would shape what came next. The moment when battlefield medicine faced its greatest test, June 6th, Normandy. Cold seas, wind tearing across the channel. In the gray dawn, waves of American soldiers hit the beaches under machine gun fire so intense that even steel helmets rang like bells. The U.S. Army had prepared for casualties, but nothing could truly prepare them for the chaos that unfolded at Omaha Beach. In the first hours alone, thousands were hit. The tide turned red. Medics, carrying only a few plasma bottles each, crawled from crater to keep the wounded alive. The beaches offered no shelter, no hospitals, and no guarantee that supply boats could reach them. Yet the system that Drew's ideas had inspired was ready for its defining moment. Aboard hospital ships anchored just offshore, Medical teams began unpacking hundreds of plasma units flown in from Britain the night before. The blood logistics chain, stretching from a New York donor's arm to a medic's field kit, now faced the most dangerous test imaginable. On the beach, the medics performed miracles with almost nothing. Corporal Joseph Lapointe, a 22-year-old combat medic, remembered jabbing needles into half-conscious soldiers while bullets snapped overhead. He propped plasma bottles on shattered rifles, letting the golden liquid flow down through plastic tubing into arms trembling with shock. Men who should have died lived. The results stunned even commanders. By midnight, field hospitals established just inland from Omaha reported survival rates exceeding 90% for those who reached them alive. That was not a statistic. It was a revolution. Every plasma bottle represented a chain of hundreds of people: donors, scientists, chemists, drivers, pilots. Together, they defied the chaos of war with organization, science, and compassion. But the system's greatest strain came not at Normandy. It came weeks later, deep inside France. In August 1944, as Allied divisions pushed toward Paris, the wounded began to outnumber the available plasma supply. Trucks carrying medical crates were being destroyed or delayed by enemy fire. Temperatures soared. Desperate, the U.S. Army Medical Corps made a radical decision: to create mobile blood depots that would travel directly behind the front lines. Each convoy carried refrigeration units powered by gasoline generators, protected by armed escorts. They became known as the blood runs. Drivers raced across bombed roads, through forests and villages still contested by German troops, to deliver plasma to frontline hospitals before it spoiled. In many cases, they arrived minutes before the generators failed or the fighting reached the road. The idea worked, and it changed battlefield medicine forever. Casualties who would have been written off as hopeless in previous wars were now treated and returned to duty. By autumn, General Eisenhower personally commended the Medical Corps for maintaining unbroken lifelines to the front. Historians would later describe this as the quiet miracle of logistics, a system that saved more Allied lives in 1944 than any new tank or bomber. Yet, the climax was not only about the blood that reached the front, it was also about what happened when it didn't. Because as winter fell, and the Allies met their fiercest resistance in the Ardennes, the entire lifeline of blood and plasma came within hours of collapse. December 1944, the Ardennes forest. The snow was deep, the air biting, and the roads nearly impassable. The Allies had believed the war was nearly over until the Germans launched a desperate counterattack. The Battle of the Bulge. It was chaos all over again. American units were encircled. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Medics had to cut off frozen boots and clothing from the wounded. Plasma froze solid in its bottles before it could even be used. In the field hospitals near Bastogne, doctors faced a nightmare. Thousands of casualties and no way to resupply. German artillery shattered bridges and blocked convoys. The blood runs that had sustained the armies of liberation were now trapped by snow and enemy fire. Inside one makeshift tent, Captain John H. Gillespie, a surgeon with the 101st Airborne, described performing amputations with gloves stiff from frost, praying that plasma would arrive before another man bled out. His notes would later read, "We had the skill. We lacked the blood." The U.S. Army Medical Department needed a miracle, and they found it in the skies. From England and France, transport crews of the U.S. Army Air Forces volunteered for what would become one of the most dangerous resupply missions of the war, Operation Blood Drop. Their orders were simple: fly over German lines, drop insulated containers filled with plasma directly to the surrounded troops of Bastogne. The planes flew low, often below 400 feet, through blizzards and enemy anti-aircraft fire. Each crate was packed with layers of straw, dry ice, and waxed paper to keep the plasma from freezing. Parachutes snapped open over the white forests like blossoms in winter. On December 24, 1944, Christmas Eve, the first blood parachutes landed behind American lines. A medic named Private James McClure later recalled, "We thought it was food. Then we saw the Red Cross on the crates. And we cheered." That night, for the first time in days, surgeons could transfuse again. Inside the flickering tents of Bastogne, plasma thawed over camp stoves. Soldiers on the edge of death felt warmth return to their hands. For many, it meant surviving until morning. It was one of the few moments in that brutal winter when science and courage combined so perfectly that they seemed divine. Historians would later call the Bastogne plasma drops a triumph of medicine under fire. But for the men who lived through it, it was simpler. It meant going home. By January 1945, as the skies cleared and Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve Bastogne, the system was restored. Within days, trucks carrying fresh plasma and blood resumed their routes. The U.S. had proven something extraordinary, that even under siege, its medical lifeline could not be broken. What began as one man's experiment in a quiet lab had become an unstoppable global network, the first modern blood supply chain in history. And in those frozen forests, amid explosions and smoke, the legacy of Dr. Charles Drew's technique was written not in textbooks, but in the lives of every soldier who opened his eyes again. The climax of the war for medicine had been reached. But the story did not end with victory. It carried on in hospitals, in homes, and in the post-war world that learned from it. Because what followed next was not just the end of a war, but the birth of a new kind of medicine. One built on what the battlefields had taught humanity. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the world began to count its dead and its survivors. For every name carved into marble, there were others who had lived only because of a bottle of plasma, a medic's hands, or a doctor's vision. The final statistics astonished military planners and medical historians alike. Across all theaters of war, the U.S. Army treated over 680,000 combat wounded, and more than 90% of those who reached medical care survived. It was the highest survival rate of any major conflict in history up to that point. The difference was not in the weapons, but in the care systems built behind them. The blood and plasma network that began as Dr. Charles Drew's experiment had matured into one of the most complex and efficient supply systems ever created. By 1945, the Red Cross had collected over 13 million units of blood from American donors, enough to fill entire hospital ships. That effort required unprecedented cooperation between civilians and the military. Housewives, factory workers, school teachers, and students all rolled up their sleeves. Blood drives became patriotic rituals. Posters showed smiling donors under slogans like, "Give blood, save a life. Help win the war." Behind each drop of plasma sent to the front was a chain of trust that reached across continents. It was the embodiment of democracy's strength. Voluntary sacrifice turning into organized salvation. Even the enemy recognized its power. Captured German officers, upon seeing the vast medical infrastructure of captured American bases, were reportedly astonished. One medical officer, interviewed after the war, said, "We had surgeons as skilled as yours, but you had the means to reach every soldier. That is what defeated us." It was not arrogance. It was logistics, compassion, and planning operating together on an industrial scale. In the Pacific, where jungle heat and disease threatened every operation, the same system adapted to extremes. Blood was flown directly from island to island in insulated containers. sometimes dropped by parachute to Marine units, fighting in Saipan and Iwo Jima. Naval hospital ships, like the USS Solace and USS Bountiful, became floating laboratories, treating thousands with plasma while still under air raid alert. This global reach had never existed before in human history. From a scientific perspective, it marked the first time medicine had kept pace with warfare, rather than trailing behind it. Dr. Drew's principles had spread so widely that they no longer belonged to one man, one hospital, or one nation. They had become a blueprint for saving lives in any battle, anywhere. And when the final victory came, the survivors carried that blueprint home. Many combat medics returned to civilian life as doctors, nurses, or paramedics, founding the emergency medical systems we still use today. The field blood transfusion kits developed for Normandy became the prototypes for civilian trauma care. Even the term MASH unit, made famous in later wars, grew from the same seed planted in 1940, that mobility and medicine could coexist. But the aftermath was not only measured in innovation, it was also written in memory, in quiet hospitals, where the wounded learned to walk again, and where the meaning of survival became something deeply human. Because after years of destruction, the same system that had conquered death on the battlefield now had to face the peace and rebuild life itself. In the peaceful years that followed, the lessons of World War II medicine rippled far beyond the battlefield. What had begun as a desperate wartime innovation now shaped the very foundations of modern healthcare. The U.S. Army Medical Department, working with civilian research institutions, began codifying everything learned during the war: sterilization methods, plasma preservation, mobile surgery techniques, and the organization of medical evacuation chains. These would become the cornerstones of post-war medicine, not only in America, but around the world. The most direct continuation was the creation of civilian blood banks. In 1947, the Red Cross established a permanent national blood donation program, based entirely on Dr. Drew's wartime model. For the first time in peacetime history, nations maintained organized, refrigerated reserves of blood ready for disasters, accidents, and surgeries. Hospitals that once struggled to keep small local supplies could now draw from national storage systems. A child in rural Nebraska could receive blood from a donor in Boston within 48 hours, a miracle unthinkable before the war. Medical students studied field techniques developed under fire, the rapid transfusion procedures used in Normandy, the sterilization protocols designed for Pacific humidity, the triage systems refined in the Ardennes. Every civilian hospital now carried echoes of the war, of plasma bottles hung from tree branches and surgeries performed under artillery flashes. And though Dr. Charles Drew had died in 1950, his name became synonymous with scientific courage and humanitarian vision. Universities honored him. Military hospitals taught his principles. Even those who never knew his story lived because of it. But there was a quieter legacy, too: the moral transformation the war had forced upon medicine. In the 1930s, medical science often served the interests of nations or ideologies. In the 1940s, on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, it began to serve humanity itself. Doctors no longer distinguished between soldiers by nationality when they were dying in the same mud. Captured German and Japanese prisoners were often treated with the same plasma and care as Americans, acts that astonished the wounded enemies who had expected cruelty. In a war defined by industrial killing, this mercy became its own weapon, one that proved the Allies' humanity was as organized and powerful as their armies. The logistical systems built to save soldiers now responded to new kinds of crises: earthquakes, epidemics, floods. In 1948, when a massive earthquake struck Turkey, American Red Cross units used the same refrigerated blood trucks once used in France to assist the wounded overseas. The world had changed, and so had medicine. Every modern emergency room, every airlifted trauma patient, every mobile blood donation van, all trace their lineage to that fragile wartime chain of care. In retrospect, generals and historians realized that victory in World War II had not only been won by tanks and planes, it had been secured by the ability to keep men alive long enough to fight again, and to live beyond the fight. That ability, born from one doctor's insistence that knowledge could conquer distance and prejudice, reshaped what civilization meant after 1945. From the ashes of the most destructive conflict in history emerged something enduring, something deeply human. The understanding that in war, as in peace, the most powerful weapon is compassion made practical. And it was this truth, more than any bomb, any tank, or any code, that defined the final legacy of the blood that saved a generation. When historians speak of World War II, they often speak of tanks, bombers, and generals, the great engines of destruction that decided empires. But beneath all of it ran another current, quieter and far more enduring: the battle to preserve life amid death. One doctor's idea, to make blood portable, to make it last, changed not just the fate of soldiers, but the moral architecture of war itself. Dr. Charles Drew never commanded armies or held rank in government. Yet his laboratory tables and centrifuges altered the outcome of countless unseen battles. Every medic who knelt in mud and rain to save a comrade carried Drew's vision with him. Every truck, every plane, every crate of plasma was an act of faith. That organization, science, and mercy could exist even on humanity's darkest day. That faith reshaped the post-war world. It built the blood banks that still sustain hospitals, the emergency systems that race through cities, and the humanitarian networks that cross borders in times of disaster. In that sense, Drew's legacy, and the legacy of the unnamed medics, nurses, and donors who followed him, reached further than victory ever could. For war always ends, but the compassion it forced humanity to rediscover endures. When the last guns of 1945 went silent, what remained was not only a world rebuilt from rubble, but a promise born in the chaos, that the truest measure of civilization is not how efficiently it destroys, but how fiercely it chooses to save. And that is why one field doctor's technique, born of necessity, guided by courage, and carried by thousands, saved more lives than any weapon ever could.